Welcome to the Quest podcast. I'm Brandon Robertson. The writer Lao Tzu once said, "A good traveler has no fixed plans and is not intent on arriving." That's been my experience as I've traversed the vast terrains of spirituality in my own life. I've discovered that the more questions I ask and the more places I wander, the less I know, but the more I get the chance to stand in wide-eyed wonder at the bigness of this world. On this podcast, I'll bring you conversations with folks from around the world who inspire me and fan my own flame to go deeper on this journey of spirituality. And I hope that as you listen, you're challenged to rethink the way that you view the world, that you're inspired, and that you walk away with that same wonder that I get from having these conversations. So I'm really excited and honored that you've joined me today. Let's listen in to today's conversation. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Quest podcast. This is the first official podcast-only episode of the Quest, but if you've been following along, we've been doing a series of live interviews over on Facebook, about 2 a week actually, and I'll eventually be turning all of those interviews into podcasts. But I really want you to come and join us for the live conversations where you can ask your questions to my guests in real time. So if you're interested in following along that way, hop on over to Facebook and then search for The Quest. It's a page, you can follow it, and you'll get updates whenever I go live with a guest. But today I'm really excited to premiere an interview that I did actually 4 or 5 months ago with somebody that I really admire. His name is Jim Wallis, and he is an author, an activist, and the founder of the magazine and advocacy organization Sojourners. This conversation with Jim centers on the religious right and how progressive people of faith can reclaim our spot as political activists for the common good. You know, I'm deeply inspired by those who live within that intersection of faith and public life, and I'm really dedicated to doing that kind of advocacy myself. I'm actually currently getting another master's degree in political science right now because I want to have the ability to speak and understand and help mobilize my faith and people of faith to actually make real change in the policy world, because policies really do impact lives. Jim Wallis is really one of the trailblazers in this field of being progressive, being committed to Jesus and the way of Jesus, and being in political and public life. And so I'm really excited to have the chance to talk to him, and I know that the insights in this conversation will be as healing and inspiring to you as they were to me, especially in this most divided moment of our political life, especially in America. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Jim Wallis. So the basis for your new book, Christ in Crisis, comes from this Reclaiming Jesus declaration that you helped draft a couple years back around the election of President Donald Trump. Can you tell me a bit about the Reclaiming Jesus statement and this moment of American public life where you feel like Christ is in crisis?
Sure, Brandon, nice to be with you today. When the election happened in 2016, I began to get all these phone calls, just a legion of phone calls. Black pastors who were afraid of their youth group kids getting racially policed. Immigrant families who weren't sure who'd be there at dinner at night because of deportation threats. Muslims who were they're banned. They're going to be banned. So all these people would call. The Georgetown where I teach, the president called and said, I can't get my Muslim students back to school. They're being banned. So it was a very tough time in that first 6 months of Donald Trump's presidency. So after the election, but then after he started, things began to happen, and people were just didn't know what to do. And I think they called me because they thought I'd know what to do, and I didn't. But they kept calling
Totally.
And so finally, Bishop Michael Curry called, first black presiding bishop, Episcopal Church, and he said, "I'm just reacting. Immigration, refugees, one thing after another. I'm reacting. I'm not acting in faith, asserting my faith. Can we talk?" And so he came down, and a 5 o'clock dinner went on until like kicks out at 11 o'clock that night. Out of that came the Reclaiming Jesus declaration. And it was he and I and about maybe 15 elders. Elders meaning we're old. But I didn't want pastors to have to sign what would be a strong statement because it could lose them their jobs. So we just signed it. All us old guys, men and women, and very diverse racially and gender. But we're older, been around for a long time, so we didn't care what anybody thought of us. So anyway, I do declarations, but my young team does videos, and they did this video about this declaration that went to 5 million people. This is before Michael Curry was famous for the royal wedding sermon.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning, and then I just was getting up every morning. I couldn't sleep in the mornings, getting up and going downstairs, and I began to look at the Book of Acts, and I noticed when you go to the scriptures with new questions, even if you've been to these scriptures before, there's always new answers. And so I found this. Every time Peter and John would do something, they walk out of the gate, and here's this disabled man who wants some help, and they famously says, "Peter, gold and silver have I none, but in the name of Jesus, get up and walk." In the name of Jesus was said over and over and over again. When they would heal, when they would teach, 3,000 came the first day and 5,000 the next time. Always in the name of Jesus. So finally they were arrested. And the text is wonderful. It says, "These are uneducated and ordinary men," meaning no one was worried about them. And I was in Harvard for this book tour just 2 weeks ago, and where they don't think much there either of ordinary, uneducated men. so they weren't worried about them. But then they said, "But this name is stirring the people up." And so they pulled them in and they said, "Okay, you can go, you ordinary, uneducated men, but you can't say that name anymore. Stop using that name. The name is inspiring people. You can't use the name." And Peter famously said, "Well, what is right or wrong is up to you, but we cannot not speak of what we have seen and heard." So it was the name, and that's what Bishop Curry and I focused on, the name of Jesus. Are we living in, acting in, working in, voting in that name? And we weren't. And so that was a declaration. So then the book became for me wrestling with these gospel texts. And there really are 8 Jesus questions that he either asked or was prompted to answer by people. Who is my neighbor? What is the truth? Who is the greatest? And so that's what I did in this book. And this is a Jesus book, not a Trump book. But here are Jesus questions we have to answer, no matter what our politics across all the boundaries, as you know, are. And we've been on this book tour where it's meant to spark conversations about Jesus. And it's been terrific. It's just been very encouraging, very diverse people who are not just racially and gender diverse, but religiously, and a lot of former somethings.
Yeah.
Young people say I'm formerly this, but here I am. I want to talk about Jesus. So we had a great time, and so far the book, I'm hoping and praying, is a small way to help spark conversations about Jesus.
Totally. And what's really interesting is that we occupy this space, I think Sojourners and you and Bishop Curry, on what is becoming called in kind of popular parlance, the Christian left. And like currently right now, I have the pleasure and honor of being able to serve as a consultant to a number of the Democratic presidential campaigns. And the thing that I'm consistently surprised at, however, is that while this Christian left is very vibrant and the religious left is vibrant at a grassroots level, at the higher levels, on these presidential candidates and even in many administrations, there's this resistance to engage with faith among progressive people. And I just wonder if you have any insight into like why there is such resistance among presidential campaigns or candidates or administrations that are progressive to engage with this robust faith community and tradition that has existed throughout the history of our country.
Well, it's ironic, isn't it, Brandon, that the Democratic Party's core political base is African American women, right? They'll say that. And that is the most religious population in America.
Totally.
Bar none, the most religious population. So isn't it ironic that Democrats are reluctant to speak about faith? So I've been having these conversations with these candidates as well, and I talked to Pete Friday night, and and I said to him, we need to create more than a religious left, because the religious right is wrapping politics around faith. And I don't want to do on the left what the right has done on the right. And here's a radical idea. How about our faith shapes our politics and not the other way around?
Yeah.
So we had a good discussion about this just a few days ago. And I think if we can have that deeper conversation, so we don't have a binary religious right, religious left, but how can Jesus hold us accountable and shape our politics even across boundaries? So that's what I'm hoping for, not just a binary conversation, now we have a religious left. Now, you'll be described that way, and I would get described that way too. But I'm saying don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. How do we go deeper here? And he gets it. I mean, Pete gets it. And he's, I said to him, I said, this is God's, he makes me smile all the time when he just brings up faith on a stage, even when that isn't the question. He'll bring up God and climate change or whatever. And I said, here you are, a millennial, youngest candidate, and you're a mayor in a Rust Belt state, and a gay married man talking about Jesus all the time. And this freaks out the religious right, because they never talk about Jesus. And here you are talking about Jesus. And I said, this is just God's sense of humor to just spoil all to just upend all the conversations. And we had a great time with that conversation. So I think one of my purposes, or one of the hopes I hope for you that I can make some small contribution to, is changing the religious narrative, as you're suggesting here, in the 2020 election. So it's not Republicans' own religion. Literally, as you know, you've got Christians who, in some congregations, are told by their fellow congregants, you can't be a Christian and a Democrat. And they're told that, right? And that's crazy. So God doesn't own, Republicans don't own God.
Yeah.
They don't. So how do the Democrats speak authentically from their faith and values, whatever that is, and have a different conversation? That's what I'm trying to help to spark.
Totally. And I think you do this well in your book, and you've just mentioned it, but we're in this moment where it does feel like everything is so binary. Like our country, everyone's saying it's more divided than ever. Maybe that's not historically accurate, but we're pretty darn divided. And this left versus right, even religiously, seems to not actually be the antidote. Rather, it seems to be our impulse, a natural impulse. But as you're talking about, I feel like in the last election, one of the things that was really unfortunate was that Democrats and the Clinton campaign overlooked middle America, which is just this vast array of primarily religious, primarily more moderate people. And I just wonder, in your book, you do a great job of, like you said, going deeper and not necessarily just touting a liberal party line. But I wonder, like on a ground level, how do we help in individual congregations help get out of this binary system and help us see that following Jesus isn't necessarily about aligning with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, but it might actually call us out of faithful alignment with either one, wherever we're standing. Yeah.
Well, we make what you just said into a sermon because
Totally.
that's exactly right. This is really important that we not just align ourselves with, and in fact, in the book, I talk about feeling politically homeless, and I'm feeling that on the road. A lot of people say, I feel that way too. I feel politically homeless. And so I think that's a good and healthy feeling. And I think how to not be in this binary moment is really crucial. In fact, Mayor Pete said, Friday said, we were talking, he said, I'm concerned about the day after the election,
Yeah.
no matter who wins, because the healing that we need is so critical now. And both sides want to fight. You just fight.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of these candidates, and we're having a conversation, but I think we've got to go to a better and deeper place. And there's a hunger for that on the road. And there are cracks. There are cracks in the wall. Like there are cracks in the wall on the evangelical, conservative, Republican side with some white evangelical Republican women who are making some shifts, and some of them had Beto bumper stickers on their Texas Lexus cars when they drove into their megachurch parking lots during the last election, and their husbands and their pastors got mad at them. And they said, well, we care about life at the border as well as life in the womb. That breaks up categories, you know. I think a number of white evangelicals, and you would know this better than I, but I meet them all over the country, and they're breaking with their parents on climate change and LGBTQ issues. They're breaking with their older generation. Now, that doesn't show up in the polling so much because many of them are just leaving their faith altogether.
Yeah.
So when they're asked by a pollster, are you born again Christian? Or they says, no, not me. They're evangelically adjacent, you might say.
Yeah.
We're raised in it. But they don't identify anymore. But they are white evangelical kids growing up in that tradition like I was, and I think you were too.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a crack. And also evangelicals of color are really, their voice is rising all over the country and certainly around the world. So that also is breaking up some of the old fault lines. So to me, that's hopeful.
Totally. Me too. And in the book, you also engage not just this political division, but like the interreligious division. And like you said, in the book, you address 8 key questions that Christians kind of need to grapple with. And on that image question, so much of my work has focused as a pastor and a faith organizer at this intersection of LGBT rights and the church. And initially, when Reclaim Jesus came out, there was a little bit of a kerfluffle about not clearly mentioning LGBT people. But in the book, you make clear and powerful statements calling for the support of LGBT people. And you also talk about what it's like to engage with conservative Christians who might not be able to get there theologically, but you call on them to stand up for the civil rights of LGBT people. I just wonder how you see that happening. Like, what advice do you give to those of us who do engage with people who are theologically not at LGBT affirmation and are really skeptical about being able to advocate for policies that seem out of alignment with their theology?
Well, you know, this I did this media outlet that my 23-year-old press secretary knew about. She came from Stacey Abrams' campaign to work for me and for us, but she put me in touch with Now This. You probably know all about it. Big millennial site. And so I went up to New York, and you basically just talk into their camera, a kind of an op-ed that's on your mind, and they put all the footage and things around it. And the video that they did out of that has reached 1.5 million people.
Yeah.
1.5 million, mostly young people. And I had dinner with a young person last night, and she said, when in the video, when you said LGBTQ are initials for people who are beloved of God. She said, to me, that just said it all. That just said it all, laid it out. And then people, no matter what they want to discuss, you got to start there. As you say, this is the image of God. You start there. And then, you know, people have to deal with all of the biblical text interpretations and all the rest. But, you know, Mayor Pete, I love what he's doing. He uses this word beckon. I want to beckon people who haven't yet come to, you know, comfortability with same-sex marriage, for example. I want to beckon and not attack them, which is really a wonderful approach. So how do we beckon people? How do we get people to have a different conversation? It's generational for sure, and but I think that there's like she was saying last night with her kids, that she said, I want my kids are in schools where their teacher, their male teacher, has a husband, and how could I teach my kids that there's something wrong with that? So I don't want to have to unlearn them things they're hearing in church, right? I think a new generation is gonna. I say in these talks that some things, a generation decides what is no longer acceptable to them. And it's been accepted for a long time, and it can't be changed. It's about to change. They say, well, it's no longer acceptable, and watch me change it. So Parkland kids on the guns. They're not saying, well, the NRA controls everything, and Congress is bought, so nothing we can do. They say, we're voting now. Watch me. Or climate. They're striking. 14-year-old kids are striking on Fridays. They say, you haven't done enough, adults, so we're going to do it. Or that privilege and punishment are finally still a result of skin color in America. I'm sorry, not acceptable for us anymore. So when Brittany Packnett endorsed my book, it's a top endorsement on the back. Brittany Packnett's, I met her in Ferguson, right? She's a Black Lives Matter movement leader. And she says, we have to reclaim Jesus over all of God's people, God's children. And she's a church leader, right? So, or rabbis and imams that are friends of mine say they always feel safer when Christians talk about Jesus and not all the other stuff. So I think, you know, people, you know, why have people moved more quickly on some of the LGBTQ questions? Because even white Christians, white people, know LGBTQ people. Their own children, they're friends of their children, they're friends of the family. And when I was growing up, people didn't think they knew any, what we call gay people back then. Yeah. So now it's and one of the reasons we're moving too slowly on the racial stuff is white people don't know black people. Yeah. 75% of white Christians or white people have not one significant relationship with color in their social circle. 75% still to today. And I'll say tonight in Seattle, self-styled liberal, LA Bay Books is a big bookstore here. So they'll draw a pretty progressive crowd all over Seattle. And I'll say, you know, most of the people in this room don't even know that black parents in Seattle and Tacoma this morning and every morning were afraid of their kids going to school. Wow. So this is about relationship. You know, we live in different countries. That is in the news. Watching MSNBC in the background here is political. It's constitutional, all that, moral, spiritual, but it's about whether there's a we, the word we, going forward into a new American nation, or whether it's always going to be us versus them. That's the core. And Jesus speaks so directly to that. Who is my neighbor? Who's your neighbor? And if you've seen the book, that chapter is still one of my favorites. Your neighbor is somebody who's different than you. That's what the Good Samaritan text says.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think I'm not necessarily optimistic about Trump could win re-election. The people who don't know that, but don't know what's happening in the country. Yet, my son called me the night of the election, having voted for the first time. And actually, I talked to him this morning. He's a senior now at Haverford, and he called me that night. He said, "Dad," he said, "I know your big thing is hope. That's your big thing, Dad. So I don't want you to lose hope over this, Dad, because yeah, it's going to be hard. But me and my generation, we got this, Dad. It's okay. Don't lose hope."
Totally.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think, there is, I feel similarly. It's optimistic, but cautiously optimistic, because you're right. I think there are so many ways where there still is such anger in this country about the way things are on both sides, and the future is a bit uncertain. I think the last question that I just kind of want to pick your brain on, because I think a lot of people are struggling with this, is there are many people, I see it in my congregation all the time, whereas I, as a pastor, begin to engage political or social topics from the pulpit, people get really uncomfortable and say, our faith should not be interacting with politics, and politics should stay out of faith. And your whole life has been at this intersection.
Yeah.
Your calling has been at this intersection. So I just wonder if you could give a brief understanding of your theological and philosophical perspective on how progressive faith should interact with and interface with politics.
Well, this book was written to those pastors who asked that question. So, when you're doing a book tour, you get talking to lots of media people like you. You're a pastor too, but you're doing media here. So CNN calls me, and John Blake, who writes on religion and race, and he said, how come all the Christian musicians out there don't want to bring justice issues into their music because they're afraid of polarizing or politicizing their audiences? And I hear this, he said, from pastors too. They don't want just what you just now said. They're afraid to raise anything. And what it brought to mind in his question, and he did this article, it came out last week sometime, so you could find it. What came to mind for me was, here's Jesus' last sermon before he goes into Jerusalem. And it's the Matthew 25 text sermon. And so here's Jesus, and he gets up and says, well, I was going to talk about vulnerable people today, marginalized people. But, I'm afraid that we're so politicized these days, that could cause a lot of political division. So I'm not going to do that. Rather, I'll just say how to get to heaven. Well, that's not what he did.
Yeah.
In the text, in that Matthew 25 text, it was a text that brought me to Christ out of the student movement. He said, I called it was me test. Thirsty. I was naked. I was a stranger, and the word there means immigrant. That's what the word Greek means. I was sick. I was in prison. And they said, Lord, when do we see you hungry and thirsty and naked and sick and in prison and not do anything or say anything? Well, you let them take all my food stamps away. I'm working 3 jobs but can't feed my family. Or I was black and flint and couldn't get clean drinking water. Naked, I had everything stripped away, so I couldn't even grow farm food on my ground in Guatemala. And there was gangs threatening my kids, and so I picked up my kids and I went to America to get an asylum, and they took my kids away from me and put them in cages. And I've been banned and immigrants and I was sick. They're ripping my Medicaid away. And then, black and white drug use is the same, but incarceration is all black and brown. So I'm incarcerated, and as you have done it to all these people and said nothing, you've done it to me. So I went to a book from a preacher yesterday, and I said, I believe you got to love your people enough to preach the gospel to them. And so the pulpits are going to be key places. And so I'm inviting pastors. The pastors come out to get books signed. They said, we're taking this book into our churches for 2020. We're going to have small groups around this book and talk about Jesus. What about Jesus? What about Jesus? And so I just want to ask, what about Jesus? And if it's Jesus, he's saying, as you welcome the stranger or don't, you welcome me. That's what he said. Did he mean it? Did he mean it? Do we take that seriously? And then we apply it to someone who's demonizing, to demonize immigrants, to dehumanize them. It's not just lack of compassion, it's Antichrist. And I'll say that tonight and say it. Antichrist, white nationalism. It's not just race, it's Antichrist. It's really down to that. So that's the 20 conversation I want to have before the election.
Totally. It's an important and powerful one. And you, as always, have been such an important voice on this. And I'm not just saying this, the book Christ in Crisis, Why We Need to Reclaim Jesus. As another pastor, you'll hear it from me. I do think I want to bring it into our churches because it is a good model and gives good wisdom and insight for how we can engage these conversations as people of faith. So thank you for it.